The grandmother lost custody of her grandson, and the court was left shocked by the boy's revelations. A loss. No, a tragedy. But when someone loses something, it is often in reference to objects and possessions that one could simply find again at a later time after a thorough search. No, what Elizabeth Brown had suffered was a tragedy. But tragedies are those that are harder to recover from, and their losses are far more impactful on the daily lives of those that suffer through them. But for Elizabeth, it was the tragedy of the loss of family. She'd seen many people come and go in her 72 years of life. The friends who passed away early, older family members whose voices she could barely recall. The tense, though the loss of her own parents still stung her heart. Even beloved pets that she cherished, whose short lives were dearly missed. Oh, what she lost in the last year was more than that. That to the promise of a bright future, she lost her only son and her daughter-in-law to a tragic accident. A misfortune and ill-timed event that caused the tragedy to happen, and an icy patch of road, a semi that accelerated too quickly and crashed into the side of a car. The crunch of steel, a scream of surprise, and then silence and death, and then to leave behind their only son. Jack Brown, her grandson, was an even darker tragedy. Hence the boy himself was barely 8 years old, and now would grow up without knowing the full depth of the love of his parents. But to Elizabeth, this was the worst that could happen. At least with her, she grew up knowing her parents loved her dearly, and when she reached adulthood, she knew fully the type of people that they were, the sacrifices that they made in their lives for her well-being and protection, and she could come to love them not just as protectors, but as elders whose age and wisdom she could draw strength from, knowing that they survived to old age, and she could too thanks to the lessons they gave. It was a love that she and Elizabeth's own son, Terrell, had before his passing, and one that now Jack would not have. Her heart ached for the young boy, and through a sense of love and familial duty, she took him under her care as best she could. Who better than family to raise the young man? He was quiet and reserved even before his parents' passing. A child who didn't quite fit in with his peers and preferred to be alone more than with other children. He was an easy target for bullies and was sensitive to emotions and teasing. A Pinsy, and for Elizabeth, she wanted to make sure that he was raised in a home that understood these weaknesses and could properly foster them into strengths of character. She knew that the foster care system wouldn't give him the grounded foundation he needed to blossom into a proper young man. People who didn't know him and were strangers couldn't truly know him or his circumstances. Plus, it was wrong to throw a child who suffered the losses that he did into a system of rotating strangers. However, Elizabeth knew there was one small problem to her raising Jack by herself. Addie was tight, and her health wasn't exactly the best. She had retired as she should have with her husband at 65 years old. The Pants and their golden years together were very sweet, at least until her husband passed, and the retirement funds they had saved for years started to dry up. The Spence's roughy biopsies, With the arrival of Jack, those funds stretched even more, and try as she might, she could barely keep up with the expenses of child-rearing that were far more expensive now than when she raised Daryl with a partner. Clothing, food, medicine, entertainment, schooling, and more. Poor Daryl and Janelle were in the prime of their life, barely with any savings, when their life was snuffed out. As to the meager funds they earned from the life insurance that was on Daryl barely paid off the expenses of medical bills and the funeral costs, and barely left enough for their son to grow on. Still, Elizabeth made it work as best she could, going nights without food to ensure that Jack had the nutrients needed to thrive at school, scrimping, saving, and working hard in a side hustle for her neighbors to make sure that he had entertainment in the form of books and even a game console to keep him distracted, and her reward through all of this: a smile from a despondent child in pain, a hug that spoke of familial love and desperation to be loved in return, and a willingness, at least, to try and heal. He was a melancholy child, but then who wouldn't be at such a young age? The tour at least looked like the tragedy they had would strengthen their bonds, and Jack would at least become the man his parents wanted him to be. One day, though, a knock came at Elizabeth's door. It was a typical day for the two of them. Elizabeth picking Jack up from school earlier, and both of them in quietness, as Jack studied for tests and Elizabeth dozed in her chair. As to the knock had startled the elderly woman, and she rose from her chair to answer the summoned call at the door. For behind it stood in resolution 3 officers of the law, each of them bearing grimace on their faces. Elizabeth's blood ran cold as they explained to the woman that they were here as custodial officers to take Jack away to be cared for properly in the foster system by those with better means who were able to afford the living expenses of an 8-year-old child. And did little to sway them, even when Jack, accosted as he was by their authoritative strength, pleaded to not be taken away. Looking once more, tragedy and loss had befallen Elizabeth as the government and the law took away her last remaining family and carried him away from her. The waning signals of the dying lights of the police car and the crying face of the child broke her heart asunder, once again, as the wounds of loss refreshed again. She was left now in an empty home, and the pleading cries of Jack to remain with his grandmother ringing in her ears. Another tragedy. Soon, though, she had to go to court as she was summoned by the state. She had to prove and fight against the system, to prove that she was a viable caretaker for the young child. Something that she didn't think she would win. What did she have to offer a growing boy in his time of need? She was in failing health and steady decline downward, limited finances, and no means of actual support should Jack need it. She was dismayed at the fact that her lawyer wasn't much help either, as he had suggested perhaps she at least just be granted visitation at the minimum. The courtroom proceedings were long and brutal to Elizabeth, and the crowd of course murmured in agreement with the prosecuting state that she might perhaps not be the best fit to take care of Jack. The harshest, most biting critique of all was the murmur of the crowd for Elizabeth, and she stared at the floor, unable to look at the rest of the court. She had tried to do her best. The judge, though ever merciful, and in an attempt to be pragmatic and neutral in his calling, turned to Jack as he sat on the stand and nodded, allowing the boy the floor to speak his mind. Jack looked on to his crying grandmother and thickly swallowed as he rose up to the microphone to speak to the crowd around him. "My name is Jack Brown." He started off in that sweet tone of innocence that only a child could have. "I love my grandma a lot. I want to live with her. I know that no one wants me to, but I really do. Ever since my mom and my dad died, she was the only one that took me in and made me feel loved again. Mom and Dad always talked about how great Grandma Brown was, and I saw for myself why. She stopped eating so I could have a full meal. She stopped going out so I could have games and books and puzzles. She helped our neighbors for extra spending money so I could have good clothes to wear. Grandma Brown might not have a lot of money to spend, and she might be old, but there is a lot of love in our house, and she makes me not feel so scared anymore. Please don't take me away from my grandma. She makes me feel happy again, even though I miss my mom and dad." Then he sat back down. For Elizabeth, this was the most that she had heard him speak in months, and for the court it was proof enough that Elizabeth was perhaps the best person after all to take care of him. They were stunned and shocked, and the judge agreed, now swayed by the speech. Like the gavel dropped, the judgment rendered, and Elizabeth and Jack walked out of that courtroom together, smiling and knowing that his parents would be happy as well.